The United Nations Security Council will meet again in an emergency session later today after Israel expanded its military operations in Gaza amid intense bombardments, a broader ground offensive and escalating humanitarian needs in the enclave. Non-permanent members of the council have also introduced a new draft resolution that seeks to push for humanitarian pauses in Gaza. This comes after the General Assembly on Friday passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian access, a text that passed with 121 countries in favour, 14 against, and 44 abstentions. For more, let's now speak to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, thank you so much for your time. So we're back here again. The council will meet again later today. Is there any realistic expectation that the 15 members will be able to reach some form of consensus on a resolution after 4 failures to date, Sherwin?
Yeah, Nati, I think the best advice we can give at this point is that people lower their expectations about what is possible in the Security Council. As you well know, the Council has already considered 4 draft resolutions in relation to humanitarian access into Gaza. First, the Russians put forward a text calling for an immediate ceasefire. That didn't get the requisite number, the minimum number of votes for it to pass. So, things like vetoes didn't come into play. Then you had the Brazilian, a non-permanent member of the Council, introduce a text calling for humanitarian pauses. It also condemned Hamas, which was a big sticking point in the previous resolution. That received 12 countries in favour, but was vetoed by the United States with 2 abstentions. Then you had the United States introduce a draft resolution, which was then vetoed by China and Russia. And then subsequent to that, you had another Russian resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. And the concern there was that there wasn't enough consultation and that it didn't explicitly condemn Hamas and affirm Israel's right to self-defense. So these are the issues that haven't gone away as you now consider a new draft resolution that is going to be introduced by the 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council. How different, for example, would that text be from the Brazilian text, which had such overwhelming support, a few weeks back? What sort of language is it going to be included? Will it condemn Hamas? Will it affirm Israel's right to self-defense, which has been a U.S. sticking point? Remember, they still have the veto heading in here. And look, let's also understand that even if a humanitarian pause resolution were to pass the Security Council, the big question then is on implementation. Would you then expect Israel to implement the resolution, given that they have now started a ground offensive, and given that what history tells us, Sonati, is that sometimes resolutions are just ignored by Israel. There is a 2016 resolution demanding that Israel stop its settlement activity. That has done absolutely nothing to quell Israel's expansion of settlements in violation of international law. So even if you were to get passage here, what is happening on the ground is where this is going to matter. And it's going to be those backroom negotiations that perhaps the Qataris are leading, or what the United States says privately to Israel that's really going to have the biggest impact here. So I wouldn't certainly, peg your hopes on what happens in the UN Security Council. We have to watch what's going on the ground. And what's happening there is the humanitarian situation is getting worse by the hour. This was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, just this weekend. Watch.
When these hostilities end, those who have survived will face the rubble of their homes and the graves of their family members. Inflicting wounds and trauma on hundreds of thousands of people does not help anyone. The humanitarian and human rights consequences will be devastating and long-lasting. Thousands have already died, many of them children. Given the manner in which military operations have been conducted until now, in the context of the 56-year-old occupation, I am raising alarm about the possibly catastrophic consequences of large-scale ground operations in Gaza and the potential for thousands more civilians to die. Continued violence is not the answer. I call on all parties, as well as third states, in particular those with influence over the parties to the conflict, to do all in their power to de-escalate this conflict and to work towards the goal where Israelis and Palestinians can fully enjoy all human rights and live side by side in peace.
And Donati, unfortunately, that call for de-escalation hasn't happened. We are seeing a ramping up of the ground offensive, a ramping up of bombardments, and of course, the humanitarian consequences are just being exacerbated by those actions.
Speaking about, the humanitarian catastrophe that is playing out before the world's eyes in Gaza, we have seen, of course, reports that thousands of people broke into several UN warehouses and distribution centers in Gaza this weekend. Of course, we still know at this point that trucks that are carrying fuel are still not being allowed into Gaza by Israel. What more can you tell us about the situation on the ground there?
The need is very, very great, right? You talk about the trucks, Unati. Gaza used to get over 450 trucks per day before this war, before the October incident attack on Israel by Hamas. Over 450 trucks per day because this was a humanitarian crisis to begin with. Now you're hearing over the weekend some 30 trucks made it across the border. So we're at about 100 trucks over the last week, which is not meeting, it's not representing the scale of need on the ground, right? And so the push here is to get some 100 trucks possibly over a day and maybe more. And that seems to be a very big diplomatic effort that is being undertaken by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs here at the United Nations. Yes, there was a break-in at several warehouses. The UN Relief and Works Agency, of course, is the UN representation in Gaza. They say people broke into their warehouses and distribution centers over the weekend, taking wheat, flour, hygiene supplies, and other items, excuse me. They also talk about the 33 trucks carrying water, food, and medical supplies. But Unati, as you correctly point out, Gaza has been in a blackout now for almost 3 weeks because fuel is needed to run generators, fuel is needed for electricity, fuel is needed for incubators at hospitals, and so fuel is not getting in, making this crisis even more acute. The Secretary General, Unati, over the weekend also releasing a statement saying, regrettably, instead of the pause that they've been pushing for diplomatically, I was surprised by an unprecedented escalation of bombardments and their devastating impacts, undermining the referred humanitarian objective. So the focus here, outside of the UN Security Council, is still to get greater humanitarian relief, but the consequences of the bombardments, the consequences of the ground offensive in Gaza is going to make any distribution of humanitarian supplies, even if they do cross the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, it's going to complicate the distribution in what is essentially now a very dramatic war zone, Unati.
Sherwin, as we wrap up, of course, the words of Volker Turk, raising an alarm, he says. He's raising an alarm. I mean, what wonders, of course, we've seen, hundreds of thousands of civilians across many countries take to the streets condemning this war, calling for a ceasefire. Just talk to us about what is happening on the ground in the US and what is the general sentiment there?
Massive protests, not only in the region, in the Middle Eastern region, but certainly in places like the United States, essentially Israel's biggest ally on the world stage. Massive protests in New York over the weekend. In fact, there were some tens of thousands of people that gathered in the Grand Central train station, which is a central transport hub here in Manhattan, on Friday evening, essentially shutting down the place, calling for an immediate ceasefire. I think it's not lost on anyone in the international community what you can see literally happening before your eyes. This is a war that is playing itself out on social media. There are visual and dramatic representations of what is going on there. And so these are images one cannot just turn a blind eye to. So there is pressure, certainly, from the citizenry in the United States. This is not a monolithic culture where, there's just blanket support for Israel. There is certainly pushback from what is being seen as the current administration's allowance, if you will, of the extent to which Israel can defend itself here. And that really is the battle that is playing itself out. The humanitarian needs on one side and this notion that Israel has a right to defend itself. How those two meet in the middle of night is the big question facing the international community right now.
And of course, thousands of people, innocent people, also casualty there. All right, Sherwin, thank you so much for that update. Sherwin, Bryce-Pease coming to us live there from New York, of course, just giving us the very latest in terms of the United Nations Security Council meeting again in an emergency session later today.